Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest Service Department News webinar. Today, we are going to be talking about sustainability and why it perhaps hasn't been top of the agenda in the Service Department sector. My name's George Sell. I'm Editor-in-Chief at International Hospitality Media. We are a publisher of online B2B websites for the hospitality industry and event organisers. Now, today's session is going to last an hour. We're going to have around 45 minutes of discussion with our panel, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. And I'd encourage you to submit your questions. We'd like the session to be as interactive as possible. Everybody who's registered will receive a recording via email in a couple of days. Now, this Service Department News webinar stream has been sponsored by IMS, and we're just going to see a very quick video to find out a little bit more about them. So thanks to IMS. If you'd like to find out more about what those guys do, you can see contact details in the chat. So please do drop them a line. So we've got a fantastic panel with us today, and I'm going to ask them all to introduce themselves one by one. So we'll go from the top. James, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, George. Hi there. Yeah, I'm James Fry. I originally founded base Aparthotels in Switzerland. I lived over there, moved back in 2018, and have now set up Beyond Aparthotels and Apartments. We focus particularly on sustainable wellness. That's around the wellness of the building, the wellness of the guests within the environment of the building and our staff. So there's little things like non-use of chemicals, air filters for the air going into the rooms, no VOCs and paints and glues and so forth. And then surround that with carbon neutrality and a low waste environment, and happy to talk more about it as we go forwards.
Thanks, James. Veronica, over to you.
Thank you, George. I'm Veronica Broomes, and I'm wearing two hats here today. This is the hat as an operator of a service department business, which comes through Excel Property Partners Limited. And our brand is Excel City Apartments. We're based in Sheffield. And so I speak as an operator of property service apartments that are used by a range of guests, including business travelers. And the other hat I wear is actually as a consultant in sustainability. And this comes from my early career, as well as the work I've done over the years to audit buildings and to audit businesses, sorry. And my focus has been on the three pillars of sustainability, which are the environmental, social, as well as the economic.
Thanks, Veronica. Jacob, good afternoon to you.
Hi, George. How's it going? So I'm Jacob. I'm the CEO, co-founder of Stasher. In a sentence, that's like Airbnb, but for luggage storage. That was all going very well until the pandemic, when it stopped going quite so well. And that's the reason I'm also the co-founder of Treepoints. That was something we started last year. That's effectively a climate tech startup, and we help businesses with, well, environmental causes they want to support. For example, carbon offsetting, tree planting, but a whole range.
Thanks, Jacob. And Richard, good afternoon to you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Richard Rowley. I'm the CEO of the Mansley Group. We own and operate through Mansley Service Apartments 7 blocks of service apartments in London, Edinburgh, Inverness and Cheltenham. 2 of these have been operating since the 1960s, so we've been in the business a while. We also have a number of long-term let residential properties which are rent out on AST, so we're quite familiar with EPC, so we are rated in some of our buildings. Perhaps from a sort of contextual relevance of today's discussion, we own over 1,200 acres of forest, which were part of the Forestry Stewardship Council and program for the endorsement of forest certification. So, and we capture about 18 cubic meters of carbon per acre every year. So it's about 9,000 cubic meters of carbon each year. From a sustainability point of view, we've been conscious of it for a long time. We have tended to take a continuous improvement approach. So we kind of replace gas cookers with electric induction hobs, etc. But I sort of scratched my head, how can we do things better? We've been thinking of ways and how we can improve on this. We've started our cause open source work, which I think has been great. And we've just started to work with green tourism to give us some structure and direction in our approach.
Thanks, Richard. And finally, Toby, welcome to you.
Thank you, George. So I'm Toby Roberts. I am the Quality Assurance and Compliance Officer for SilverDoor Apartments. SilverDoor are the largest service department agency specialising in corporate travel. And my role at SilverDoor, as I said, is Quality Assurance and Compliance. So it's very much a project-based role with the core focus in maximising our duty of care to our corporate clients. So that can take on a number of different hats. Obviously, particularly over the last 18 months, 2 years, it's been focused on the health and safety and the quality side of things. But obviously, with current trends in the market, we have to listen more to the client, and certainly been focusing more and somewhat of our resources on the well-being and sustainability side of things. So I'm looking forward to a good discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks, Toby. So before we crack on with the conversation, I just wanted to give some context by showing a few stories that we've run on Service Department News in recent months. Having titled the discussion, Why Isn't Sustainability Being Talked About in the Service Department Sector, I did actually receive 2 press releases in the same day about operators who were trying to do something about it, which is quite heartening. So it seems like things are already changing since we planned the website. One of those stories was Lamington setting an ambitious zero carbon goal for its estate. And we've run quite a few other stories. So a lot of the big institutional landlords are really much further down the road with this agenda. So Naveen, they're aiming to make all of their properties carbon neutral by 2040. Richard's company, Mansley, was another example, was another of the press releases on the same day as the Lamington one, actually. So it was good to see that things are happening at various operators. Other things that we might want to talk about are corporate travel programs, whether they are green enough, whether they're catching up with the sustainability agenda. And green finance is also another interesting issue. So let's start by asking how the service department sector compares. How does it rank in terms of sustainability when compared with other hospitality and travel sectors? James, do you want to kick off with that one? Because I think you've got quite a good overview on that particular question.
Yeah, thanks, George. Look, I don't think the hospitality industry as a whole has performed particularly well with regard to sustainability. It has been slow to play catch up with other industries. I can understand why that is, because in most cases the operator doesn't own the hotel that they operate. It's very difficult to go to the pension fund or asset manager and ask them for some capex to invest into the building. It's very difficult to do holistically across a complete set of brands as well. I think what's interesting about the service department sector is that there are some established older players and there are some new players. One of you mentioned was Lamington and Room 2. There's people like Lock or Cove. They've rebranded their service department business too, who are making waves. I think Room 2 are a rare example. A lot of the other new ones are based around design and they focus on the experience of the guest with maybe some F&B and also the design of the rooms, I think. And I've been personally surprised because when I started up Base in 2015, one of our 3 pillars was sustainability. And I must be honest, one of the reasons we did that was because we thought everyone would be doing it. we couldn't see a world where everyone in hospitality didn't take that mantle on, and was pretty surprised as virtually no one did. And therefore we quickly became one of the leaders sort of in the industry. So I think, the service department sector has a great opportunity to pitch itself as the green solution for corporate stays in particular, as well as leisure stays, because it is slightly smaller, therefore maybe it's slightly more nimble compared to the very large hotel sector. And I think there's a fantastic opportunity if some of the bigger brands and some of the newer brands got together and just applied the 3 or 4 core credentials into what they do around, obviously, the amount of carbon they use, the amount of reducing the amount of energy they use and where they get that energy from, but also in particular to how they treat the operational aspects of the building. And one of the things for me is everyone tomorrow could change what they do. It's just a matter of changing the choices they make, and in particular the suppliers they use. All the solutions are now out there for everyone to choose, but most often people choose to go with what they know and what they're comfortable with, whereas there are a myriad of other solutions which are lower impact and enable them to operate in a more sustainable way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, James. Veronica, with your 2 hats on, how would you say the service department sector ranks in terms of its sustainability performance? You're on mute, Veronica.
Yep. Why did I not remember that? I'd say that, following on from what James said and drawing on my knowledge of what has happened or what has happened in the hospitality sector over the years, I'd say that if we think of hospitality from the perspective of tourism, there's quite a bit that has been happening for a long number of years, but that would have happened from the perspective of hotels in terms of some signing up to the Green Globe mark. I vaguely remember that was around for some time. And then the other aspect of it was looking at tourism that was part of ecotourism and therefore linked with local communities. And you had some of those initiatives which were aimed at ensuring that in local communities, there wasn't, the capacity wasn't exceeded, so that you had the abundance of tourists showing up more than the local resources and the local communities could support, and to also allow for jobs and the supplies to come from local communities surrounding or near to where those operations, those ecotourism facilities were located. So I'd say in the tourism sector, as part of wider hospitality, there has been various initiatives operating for many years. However, in terms of service apartment, I'd say that that's a sector that's certainly quite late to the party. And in part, I think that that may have come from how the sector would have evolved in somewhere like the UK, for example. In the US, they'll talk about corporate housing. But in the UK, you would have had traditional types of apartments, service apartments that were provided to corporate guests. But more recently, maybe the past 10, 15 years, you'd also have had an influx of entrants into operating service apartments. Those entrants didn't come from a hospitality background. They came primarily from a real estate background. And therefore, from a real estate background, I think that's part of the reason why that conversation never took off, because it was very much about return on investment in terms of that single bottom line, rather than looking at a triple bottom line.
Thanks, Veronica. James, you touched there on a couple of companies that you think are doing well in terms of sustainability, the companies that are leading the charge. Are there any more you'd care to mention? And maybe you can quickly talk about what you did at Base in Switzerland, because that was one of the first companies that, as you say, to really publicize its commitment to sustainability.
Yeah, certainly. I must admit, in the service department Aparthotels sector, there aren't really any brands that are excelling in this area. I think everyone at board level is obviously discussing this, but there is that difficulty of how they transition that change to move towards being more sustainable rather than just touching the surface or greenwashing, which we all know about. I know, it's much easier when you're in startup mode and you can be part of the DNA of everything you do. I'm not going to pretend that it's not difficult thing to do. I mean, with Base and certainly with my new brand Beyond, it is the sort of first thing that we look for in everything we do in terms of the buildings, how we build those buildings, what we build them out of, where the energy comes from, how we reduce the amount of energy we use, and then in terms of the operational supplies and day-to-day aspects of the building. I mean, one of the big things we did at Base, which you mentioned, and we do it Beyond, is we don't use any chemicals to clean any of the rooms, the commercial kitchens, the floors, the toilets, anything like that. There's a myth that people wake up with a sniff in the morning when they stay in a hotel because of the air conditioning or the airplane. That's complete and utter rubbish. It's because the hotels use very heavy chemicals, particularly the big American brands. All looks very shiny. You go to sleep, you wake up with a sniff because your body's very efficient and creates mucus, and you perform slightly less better than you would do otherwise because of that, 'cause your body's having to fight it, or you sleep slightly worse. And that is something that people like Google, Apple, Facebook, they all realize. If you look at the offices they're building, for instance, Google in King's Cross, they're not using any VOCs in the paints or furniture. That's volatile organic compounds, which is very detrimental to your health. And they also have air filters, and they're not using any chemicals to clean. So if you apply that to hospitality and to a place where people spend a lot of their time, particularly the staff, then you can start to have an impact and start to really importantly answer the question, what's in it for me? Because the really difficult thing about sustainability is people don't care about carbon neutrality or low one-time use plastic and so forth, because they go, what's in it for me? What am I getting out of it today? Whereas if you can say, well, how about your health? Do you want to stay in a healthy environment? They go, yeah, I get that. I like that. And then they start to support brands that then can make a big impact.
Okay, thanks, James. Toby, you obviously deal with a lot of operators, and on the quality control and compliance side, is demonstrating sustainable credentials part of what you look for from a SilverDoor perspective? And we'll go on to talk about what corporates want from their suppliers, but is it something that you talk to them about?
So it's something that's becoming more and more relevant and obvious on RFPs and various other aspects of the client demands. I would say that it's not something that's been formalized in terms of, yes, this is what we expect and this is a framework for it, as I think everyone is still in the stages of developing their own frameworks, which is why we can name, Lamington or whoever it may be that have come out and surprised everyone, with ambitious targets, and it's not the norm and in the industry's DNA to do so so far. But it's certainly an area that SilverDoor are looking into, and I'd be surprised if we haven't in the next 6 to 12 months got some kind of framework within our own systems that prefers accommodation based off sustainability efforts.
Thanks, Toby. And Jacob, with your Stasher hat on, you're presumably dealing with quite a few operators. Are you going in and doing a double sell, the Treepoints and Stasher, and how receptive are the operators that you're dealing with?
In all honesty, we haven't tried the double sell just yet, only because we've been mindful of people's the business context of the last year, really. But recently, since we've been back at conferences and doing more events, it has been fun because it as you say, I mean, they're two quite separate entities in the way that we run them, but it's nice to be able to talk to people about sustainability, which was always something that was close to our hearts anyway. And definitely the companies we have spoken to have been quite receptive. I don't know, Under the Doormat is one vacation rental provider we're now working with, for example, and plenty more that we're starting to open conversations with. I think this might just be my perception of it, and it might be slightly biased, but I do feel like 2021 was somewhat exceptional in terms of like the impacts of climate change being felt closer to home than ever before. I think this year did feel, and I don't know if that's just really because I've got a lot closer to it, but it does feel like it's moved sort of out of the abstract, this is a future problem, into the realm of, okay, this is actually an emergency we're really dealing with. So
yeah, I think you're right. I think one of the main problems is it's a very broad and it's quite a daunting topic, and it's difficult to know how to start to make an effective and measurable difference. Richard, I'd like to come to you now, because you've obviously expressed a wish to improve the performance of your estate. how are you going to go about doing that, and how do you make decisions about which areas you can improve, and how do you set your targets?
Well, yeah, thanks. I mean, as James said, I think it's easier if you're starting from scratch, because you would know that you've got the sort of current technology and you can go things. A lot of our estate, and we are owners, so we have the kind of advantage, you know, James was saying that a lot of times people lease things, but we own, so we actually have the ability to invest the money in the right way. I think the kind of challenge I have is I'm more than happy to do it, but I want to do it sort of sensibly rather than emotionally, and getting the right data is, you know, what really is the environmental cost benefit analysis of doing something is, you know, I think is really hard. I don't think it's out there really. I mean, so for example, you know, we could rip out gas boilers tomorrow. We do tend to, you know, when they go wrong and they're past their sell-by date, of course we replace them with we will probably go electric now, actually, because I think in the long term our energy will be produced by green electricity. So I think that's the sort of the way to go. So that's the kind of the direction. But to do it today, when you've got a perfectly good boiler which has got presumably lots of carbon emission within it already, just seems a kind of a total waste. And you know, I don't think there's really good. I think you can be sort of very sort of as I say, kind of emotional about it, and you can sort of make lots of PR about it, but actually what is the right answer? And I don't think a lot of that is out there. I think, you know, James has touched on some really good points about chemicals. I think we can, you know, look at, you know, replacing that. At the end of the day, clients still want a clean room, but as long as it's clean, it's probably better for our furniture and stuff as well. So as I say, I take a continuous, you know, improvement approach, and I try to take an approach which is sensible. I'm looking for experts to help me on that, people who can bring some sort of data and some structure to our approach while I'm guessing at it. So that's why I'm very happy to be part of this debate, because I'm looking forward to seeing how we can do it better.
That I was actually going to follow up with that question. Is the advice out there? Is it available, or are you starting this journey very much on your own?
I've looked at two things. I mean, I've looked at, as I said at my introduction, I've looked at Core, and I think Core have really tried to, they produced a document that we could all access, and they've analysed the problem in a way that I think is quite good, and we can all look at it. But actually, I'm not sure they've come up with any great sort of measurables. It's the measurables that's hard. That's what I find is hard. Reliable data that actually tells you whether you're making a difference or not making a difference. But we're going to use, we've decided to use green tourism. They've got a structure, and they talk about sort of people goals, communication, you know, what you can do better, you know, the sort of planet goals and the places goals. So there's kind of, there are structures that we as a team can start to work towards. And I think like a lot of, like health and safety in a way, part of the goal in things like this is getting it into the mindset of everybody. It's getting into the mindset of the people I work with, my team, to sort of do better things and think differently as in health and safety. And I think that's what this structure will do, and I think that will lead us into a better place.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I can see a couple of you want to come in on that point. Toby, I'll come to you first.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think similar to Richard said, it's difficult to set your own goals and to have your own measurables, because obviously not every company has their own sustainability expert. So SilverDoor obviously wanted to do our part in terms of sustainability and duty of care. So we undertook an accreditation recently, which is responsible, ethical and sustainable travel, which was with Quality in Tourism, which was really interesting for us. It came and looked at all of our business practices and really sat down and thought about, you know, what sustainability measures we can take to reduce our carbon impact. And obviously, as a company, SilverDoor, you know, not operating properties, our carbon footprint is relatively low, but it doesn't mean that we can't make changes, you know, to improve our carbon footprint. So that was obviously one way of doing it. And there's also other ways. I think that's massively important for the sector in terms of making sustainability measurable. So you can look at things like science-based targets. which is a non-government organisation where you can submit your group's targets. I know Lamington, I think, did that. And that basically makes sure that the goals that you are setting have an actual measurable goal, that they're in line with the 2050 Paris Agreement, which is not increasing the temperature by 1.5 degrees or more. So it basically verifies the goals that you're setting.
Thanks, Toby. And Veronica, you wanted to come in there as well.
Yes, thanks, George. And following up the conversation, I'd say that it's so important to be able to do this as continuous improvement rather than thinking it's just a quick fix and it's just making a splash. Because if you do that, that's certainly a recipe for disruptive business, and you haven't necessarily made the business case. So I'd say that it's so important at the start to do what I call an audit, a sustainability audit or a review of what you do. And you could either have someone in to do that, or you could, in not physically, they can support you to do it as a consultant, or you can decide if you want to go the route towards accreditation. My own view in terms of accreditation is that there's a lot that companies can do before you get that certification, because that certification, part of the journey is increasing awareness, but there are times when you can do that quite early. So if you have an audit, what that audit will flag, and this is something I do work with smaller business to support, is that it would flag what you're already doing. Because interestingly enough, many companies are already taking action and they may not have considered it as something they can contribute to or acknowledge or shout about in terms of sustainability. So for example, if you're an energy supplier, if you're using electricity and your energy supplier is using or investing in renewable energy, it means that that's a company you'll want to align yourself with, because you can then say, as part of what you're doing, you're sourcing your electricity from a renewable provider, supplier. It doesn't guarantee that the electricity you're receiving in that specific property is renewable energy, but it means that you can be looking at that in terms of longer term, supporting those businesses, those energy providers already investing in renewable energy. The other suggestion I'll make is actually a simple commitment or a simple signing up to the SME Climate Hub. This is SME as in small and medium-sized enterprises Climate Hub. It's a global initiative from a coalition of businesses, but in the UK, we actually have it specifically. You can sign up to the UK link. So it's SME Climate Hub UK. And there, once you've signed up, you've entered information, they'll send you prompts and alerts, and you'll get some tools that you can start looking at to increase awareness. So that's from the environmental perspective. But if you're looking at the social pillar, I think your supply chain becomes particularly important. And people who are working with corporates are likely to find that the requests from corporates may change, because corporates actually have commitments that they need to meet, especially if it's energy, in terms of their scope 3 emissions. These are the emissions that are coming through their supply chain, their carbon emissions that are coming through the supply chain. And if it's from the S perspective, the social aspect of it, they need to look at a range of their stakeholders, not only their employees or their investors, but also their suppliers. So I think it's recognizing first where you are. And if you take stock of where you are, you can then acknowledge what you've already done and set out an action plan as to what you will do over time. But it's certainly not my view is that there isn't a need to be thinking, oh, I need to do everything now, because that's often what causes overwhelm with small businesses, because this is all coming to them suddenly and they're thinking, what can I do? And Toby mentioned the science-based targets. There are also the nature-based targets. And that would be particularly important for maybe someone like Richard, who has access to carbon sinks, the forests that are part of his holdings.
Thanks, Veronica. Talking of signing up to initiatives, we've got a question here from Bob Garner. And Bob says the major initiative in the tourism sector is now Tourism Declares a Climate Emergency, where any business connected to tourism, including service departments, can make a declaration and commit to reduce emissions with support. And he asked, what actual commitments have the panelists made to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030? Are they considering, tourism declares, to show their commitment publicly? So has anyone signed up to that? And do we think 50% reduction by 2030 is achievable for any of your businesses? I see, yeah, Jacob, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say we have signed up for that. Possibly similar to Toby, it's an easy thing for Stasher to do because we're really a tech company. We don't have sort of property estates to consider, but I mean, we've already sort of put our action plan in place. We've got, and this is again, it's like a nice sort of symbiosis of Treepoints and Stasher, but we've got a program. We already offset more than the emissions we produce. The only thing we haven't done is got that certified. Veronica mentioned like accreditation and stuff. I think we looked into that. It's a bit of an expensive process just to get the certificate that says you're carbon neutral or net zero or whatever it is, but we're kind of happy in the knowledge that we are as far as we've measured it. So
okay, thanks, Jacob. And Richard, 50% by 2030 for an existing estate is obviously hugely ambitious. Have you got a target in mind?
No, is the truth. Is the honest answer. I mean, I think, yeah, I like what kind of Veronica was saying. You know, I think, you know, that's where we're at. We need to do an audit. We may even be there with our forests. Who knows? I just don't know. But actually, even if we are, I'd want to go further. That wouldn't be enough. I want to do what I can do from a practical point of view. And going back to what I was saying before, you know, I don't want to chuck perfectly good things away that are, you know, which may not be in somebody's calculation. I mean, I have another, yeah, and I think there's a danger with some of the maths in all this, I suspect, that hasn't been really properly sort of verified. There's a kind of number out there that sounds good, but actually, does it take into account all the factors? And I suspect not. And I actually got an example where I have an EPC rating for a building. It's a stone building with a great big gap in it. It's a double walled stone building, and the EPC people came around and said, "I know it's got a double gap. It's probably fantastically efficient, but actually the sheet that I have to fill in says it's not efficient because I can only say it's a single stone wall, so it's useless, whereas it's probably very good." So it's that kind of. I think the whole industry has got a lot to learn. But so to the questioner, I'm very committed to do the best I can, and I am working on it. And I'd love to Veronica's point, get an audit and measure how we do. That's the best.
Thanks, Richard. It seems to me that recently the importance of the ESG agenda to the institutional investment community has rocketed, and I suspect that it's ESG investing that's going to drive wholesale adoption of sustainability measures rather than governments and politicians. James, you've got some recent experience of starting a business and talking with investors. What is their perspective when assessing a new accommodation business with regards to their ESG policies?
Yeah, I think we get a lot of airtime with investors because they all want to know more. They're very much in that investigative stage. They want to understand what we're doing, why we're different. Do they want to put their money into us? Maybe not until we're a bit bigger. As much as they talk about it and say they'll do it, they want to see us with more traction and track record, which is totally fair enough, and that's what we're currently doing. Now, I think it's become infinitely easier now. There is a financial benefit. I think the problem before was that everyone used to say, how much more is it going to cost me? And I think that has now gone, because in most cases councils are demanding that you build to BREEAM excellent. So I need a BREEAM excellent building. Now 5 years ago that would have cost more, because you could have just got away with building, let's say, a BREEAM very good building, so it costs more to make it excellent. But now you have to, according to building regulations and so forth, build equivalent of BREEAM excellent. So it doesn't cost any more necessarily than need be. Also, you know, if you were to look at a business and say, would you like to borrow cheaper than the rest of the market? Well, if you do an ESG based development real estate, there are multiple large funds out there who have raised huge amounts of capital for ESG debt. You can also argue that going forwards, there will be the ability to charge higher ADRs because the people who like and understand the importance of sustainability will put their money where their mouth is. And I think that will be corporates going forwards. They will demand it from their suppliers. And then on the exit side, there is also a very strong argument and some small cases maybe in the office market whereby people are prepared to pay lower yields for ESG-based investments because they fit into their fund, their ESG funds. And these guys, I think, there's something like 230 billion was raised in the first half of this year for ESG funds. So that money has to go somewhere. Now, a lot of that's going into wind farms and solar farms and so forth, but there'll also be a lot that's allocated towards real estate, and those guys are struggling. So if the laws of supply and demand work out as they should do, if there's a lot of demand and very little supply, there has to be some yield compression going forward. So I think the argument for anyone who's thinking about doing it is very, very compelling at every single level of the financial equation.
Thanks, James. We've had another question in from Tim Waters, and he is asking if there are any industry-specific advice sources. As most of our portfolio is made up of residential rented properties, there will be quite a number of stakeholders that we will need to work with and educate on what we need from them. Can anyone recommend any sources of industry-specific advice? Veronica, perhaps you might want to pick that one up.
I'm happy to make a comment, George, rather than a recommendation. Mm-hmm. And my comment is, in terms of industry specific, if you're looking at the real estate, I think what James mentioned earlier, BREEAM, is one of the frameworks that the building sector has been using for a number of years. Because I remember this has been around since I used to be doing sustainability audits for small and medium-sized businesses. So it's not new, but it's probably coming more to the forefront. What I think we are seeing now is actually developers, architects, people who are involved in new designs are looking at ways in which they can make those buildings, not only in terms of the embodied carbon, the carbon within the materials that are being used, but also looking at how longer term there'll be a lower cost of maintaining those buildings. So some are looking at, well, gardens have been around, or roofs, terrace roofs have been around for a while, but people are also looking at how they can improve or include vegetation within part of flora plants as part of that landscape. And then also looking at renewable energy sources, solar being the most popular in terms of solar panels. I know there's been this discussion around heat pumps and use of hydrogen in terms of alternatives to gas boilers, but I think it's recognizing that this is not a static scenario. It's very much dynamic, it's very much fluid. There's a lot of new technologies that will come on stream, some we may need to absorb or adapt to using within what we're doing, because part of it is behavior change. So I come back again to the SME Climate Hub, because I think that's an easy, simple one to access and begin getting some more conversations. If you're linked in the UK to any of the business support agencies, I'd say also make requests of them as to where can we get some information about that? Because when that happens, it means they're likely to put on events or provide seminars that would support businesses in order to understand what they could be doing. As a operator, I think that in addition to energy in terms of where we source it, we can also look at the items that we put for guest supplies, for example. So rather than us having miniature plastic bottles, we can be looking at ways where we can have reusable units. They're simple steps, but it means that we can begin looking at that in a more holistic way to inform our decision making, so it becomes integrated in what we do rather than being seen as an add-on. And just a quick one in terms of the comment earlier about this 50% reduction by 2030. I think it depends on the timeline that is being referenced in terms of time zero. to the 50% reduction because at the global level, the Conference of Parties, COP26, will be happening. These discussions have been taking place for decades. And when they talk about reductions, they usually use, as far as I know, 90, or as far as I recall, 1990 as a baseline year. So it's what countries were emitting at that time. It's not talking from the time you start taking action. So we need to be mindful of that. And if you're already taking many actions and you're robust and you have reduced your carbon emissions considerably, it means that it's not the next 50% that you'll be looking for. It means that you've gone as far as you could. You can then decide if you want to be offsetting by way of trees or any other type of initiative. I do have some concerns about that because trees are not necessarily the solution to absorbing carbon or being carbon sinks, not necessarily only, but it's being aware of that. It's just about getting that awareness and to be able to make informed decisions.
Thanks, Veronica. I should mention that Bob did actually paste the web address for Tourism Declares in the chat. So if anyone wants to find out more about that, then have a look after the session. And I neglected to mention that all our speakers' LinkedIn profiles are also in the chat near the top. So if you want to connect with them afterwards, then please do so. James, how do you think the construction of apartment buildings is going to change in the next few years as a result of the sustainability agenda?
Sorry, just a few. I'm not a construction expert. I'm not going to pretend to be. I'm an operational man myself. I think there will be some changes in terms of how things are built. I think what's important to realise is the impact of a building is about 15% what it's built out of and 85% how it's operated. So the number one thing you can do above anything else is insulation. Good insulation, cool air out or in, or vice versa with hot air is absolutely vital. And therefore, we actually target new build. There is some argument to be said for repurposing an existing building, and that can be done with a concrete frame, but ideally it's a new build you start from scratch. And although that has more impact day one, over the lifespan of a building of, let's say, 50 to 60 years, it will be dramatically reduced. So the key is going to be the quality of the build, the insulation of the build, the use of materials, and then obviously how it is heated and cooled going forwards. We look to generate as much as we possibly can on site, which is not always possible in terms of we have solar on the roof, we have air source heat pumps and so forth, and obviously 100% renewable energy that we buy in. There's things like building management systems which enable you to measure. Something Veronica, talked about is very important to measure what you use and be able to look at ways of reducing that. Also to be transparent, to tell people this is what we're using, this is where we're looking to go. We're not perfect, but we're moving hopefully in the right direction. And then things like FF&E, where you're getting that from, how far away that's coming from. We don't want it coming from necessarily China or Thailand. We want it to be locally sourced. The transport has an impact in how it arrives, and ideally it's part of the circular economy. So when we look to change that, we can put that back into the circular economy in some sort of way. So I think there's various aspects to do the build, how it's built, and also obviously how it's heated and cooled going forward.
Thanks, James. Let's talk a bit about the demand side, specifically from corporates. Toby, how are corporate CSR policies affecting demand for service departments? And are travel buyers demanding to see an operator or a building's sustainability credentials? Is this a driver in their decision making?
Obviously, it's been, I'd say, a positive few months for SilverDoor in that respect, that serviced accommodation and what they offer for CSR programs is certainly a positive, obviously, with the additional space. As a bare minimum, has been a huge positive, the well-being aspect of it, etc. In terms of coming into their travel programs, we are seeing it more and more. We're asked to disclose our measures in terms of what we're doing in terms of energy use and sustainability, hence why we've undertook the responsible, ethical, and sustainable travel accreditation. We're also doing ISO 14001 environmental management systems, and we've also partnered with Trees for Travel, which is a carbon offsetting project. I'm sure you're aware of them, Jacob. So yeah, we are seeing it more and more in terms of what we requested, what we as a company are asked to disclose. And it will be, as I said previously, pushed on to the operators. We're in the process right now of collecting information from operators in terms of what they're doing in terms of sustainability. And this will be an ongoing project. And no doubt we'll have some sort of framework in place where we can meet and exceed what we're expected from our corporate clients in terms of sustainability.
So at the moment, then, you are effectively the gateholder between the corporate client and the operator, and they're asking you about your green credentials, but not necessarily about the operator or the building where they'll be sending travellers. Is that right?
I mean, as it's been such a topic in terms of discussion, and it has been for 15 years, but it's very much been a tick box exercise, asking about sustainability. We've certainly seen a shift in dynamic from it just being a tick box exercise. But, as it was being such an important topic in the industry, I think until, we're not being demanded in terms of sustainability of our supply chain, but the questions are starting to be asked. And I think, you see the first movers now, like Lamington, announcing their sustainability policies. And I think it will become part of the DNA of the industry. And it's something that will be expected and won't be a competitive advantage to be sustainable in a number of years. But certainly for now, it's still early stages. And then there's so many other factors that go into choosing accommodation. But being sustainable will become more of an important factor over the coming years, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And what about the operators on the panel? Richard, has any of your corporate clients asked you about the energy performance of your buildings?
No, not really. But I think that they will. I think that it's a bit of an analogy. It was only kind of 13 years ago that we used to have non-dynamic rates. And the inevitability of needing dynamic rates and being able to feed live rates into various agencies was an inevitability. I think this is an inevitability. And so to the question about the 50% commitment, I think it's in our own interest. I mean, I think everything's going to drive us there anyway. I think we need to do it. And anyway, we want to. Costs are going up. So, we're all very motivated. All things aligned to do, to become more sustainable. And it's just going to happen. And, we're definitely on that journey. We're definitely on that path. But to answer your question directly, no, we're not getting a lot of problems as a result of people saying, or having to fill in lots of forms. When that is not something we're doing.
James, when you were operating the base properties in Switzerland, the sustainability element was a real selling factor for you. So do you think you attracted corporate businesses as a result of that over your competition?
I think it's again, like Toby was saying, it's a nice to have rather than a must have. I really, like I mentioned earlier, I think the way you communicate sustainability to the client is immensely important. You have to answer that question, what's in it for me? Because, like Richard was saying, they don't ask about how much energy you're using. But if you can translate that and say there is a benefit to the quality of your stay, to your health and the health of your employees, yeah, they really like that. People like UEFA who used us a lot, GlaxoSmithKline and so forth, they really like that aspect. And they can sell that to their employees and say, look, we've taken a choice that's better for you, and that then works well for how they work with their employees. And I think that's really important going forward, that I think more hoteliers, hospitality providers can look to go down that route. I think corporates or the employees of the corporates will say, well, hang on a minute, why aren't we at Beyond? Because they're doing all this stuff, and that's healthier and better for us to stay there. Plus, also, by the way, they are carbon neutral and they're zero waste and so forth. But that is very much a by the way thing rather than the reason to stay. And I think, I often, say that I think governments are going to legislate it, corporates are going to demand it, and individuals are going to expect it. So either you can bury your head in the sand and say it's not going to happen, or you can embrace it and say, like, let's get ahead of the curve, because this is only going one way. We're not going to get to peak sustainability in 20 years time and all go, thank you very much, we can all forget about this. This is only going to get more and more important every single year. And final thing on that note, I think it's like 1996 of the internet, when we had AOL, Lycos, Yahoo, and so forth. We all knew it was going to be a big thing. We were all talking about the internet in those days. We never realized how much of an impact it's going to have on our life. We do not contemplate how much of an impact it's going to have on our life, the measures that we're going to have to take, going forwards. And I think if people do realize that, they see the opportunity, they can embrace it, and then they can look to create a business that hopefully then also influences other businesses to take action.
The first time somebody showed me a website, I declared it would never catch on because it was so slow. So it shows you what a judge I am. Veronica, are we then still at the start of the process where client demand is going to drive the agenda? Do your corporate guests or even your leisure guests ask about how your apartments perform?
Not as yet, but interestingly enough, neither from the corporate guests, which we don't have a large proportion of those, or leisure guests, but it's interestingly enough, a few months ago, we actually had one of the larger corporate housing providers. We were signing up to their list, and I was pleasantly surprised to see on their forms for signing up questions that related to sustainability. And that was a pleasant surprise, reason being that you often get the impression that when you're being asked to quote for an apartment or for a place, the focus is on that single bottom line, only how cheap it will be or the lowest price you can offer. But the fact that they actually ask questions that show that sustainability came into the context, the social aspect of it in terms of the people aspect of it, as well as the environment, that was a pleasant surprise. And what I'd say, and this is part of the message that I'd also like to share with the audience, the listeners, the viewers, is that we need to recognize that sustainability has 3 pillars in the main. It does have many more pillars, but I'd say that maybe we should have as a focus or a reminder that it's not only about the environment. There is a social aspect of it, so there is a people aspect of it, and the economic is important because unless you can make a profit and stay in business, talking about the environment or the people becomes irrelevant, because it means you can no longer stay in business because you're not making a profit. So it's remembering that you have 3 pillars. Even if it's ESG, the different aspect of it with the G in ESG is that the governance becomes more important, because people want to know whether the decision makers, the boards, the management, whether they're single focus or they tend to work with groupthink, or they're actually making decisions that are strategic and longer term that will protect the company from brand damage in the effect of social or environmental abuses or misuse of whatever it is that they're involved in or with, and whether if there's the implications in terms of carbon, whether they've already started thinking about how they'll de-risk for carbon. So I think that whether it's the ESG or whether it's the people, profit, planet you're thinking about, it's so important that we remember that sustainability is not only about the environment.
Yeah. Thanks, Veronica. Okay, we are almost out of time, but I would like to ask you all in turn to predict how you think the service department and extended stay sector will look in 10 years' time, and how it will have changed as a result of the net zero carbon agenda. Toby, can I kick off with you, please?
So I'd like to think that, as I said before, sustainability will be part of the industry's DNA rather than just a hot topic and a hot word right now, like it is. Obviously, the more sustainability efforts that you make, I'd like to see, bookings be prioritized off that. I see corporate agendas be well developed in terms of sustainability and what they're expecting, and clear frameworks available for operators and from the corporate client side as well in terms of what they're expecting. So I think a full circle of frameworks, expectations, and a minimum standard in terms of sustainability.
Thanks, Toby. Richard, how about you?
I think similar to that, I think we all have KPIs, and I think one of our KPIs will be something that we will look at along with our profit and loss and other measures than occupancy and RevPAR. I think there'll be some well established KPIs.
Thanks, Richard. Jacob.
So I think, I mean, you want to sort of look at it through a lens of economics. I reckon the key of it's going to work is going to be all about aligning incentives. And it was a really interesting point Veronica made around the sort of single bottom line effect of people looking at prices. Because I think sustainability at the moment is still a bit of a feature. It's not yet hit the point, like Toby was saying, where you want it to be really kind of more fundamental. I think if you've seen that curve, it's like, it's sort of an adoption curve of like, especially with startups, you see this, you've got like the early adopters, the people who really care and they drive the mission forward. I mean, yeah, it's good to see people like James and stuff on this panel basically fulfilling that role, but it will take a while before we hit that mass adoption. I think it kind of does come down to prices. I think if you can do sustainability in a way that it becomes sort of competitive, affordable, and then you're competing and it's not quite like for like, because you've got sustainable versus something that's not, sustainability is going to win as long as it's sort of similarly affordable. And I guess then, yeah, the point is if we can achieve that, it should definitely happen and you'll get that mainstream adoption. That's obviously where we want to take it. And whether that's down to subsidies, taxes, whatever kind of policies you apply, it has to basically be one on the sort of economic playing field.
Thanks, Jacob. And Veronica, what's your best guess as to how things will change in 10 years from now?
You're right about best guess, George, because I don't have my crystal ball. But I'd say I'm hoping that we'll see it being more a norm, a way of doing business, rather than it being a special feature. So we'll take it for granted that the energy, hopefully by then we'll have most of the energy being derived from renewable energy sources. Therefore, it means that we're unlikely to be talking about fossil fuel in the energy that we use in buildings. And I think more importantly would be the building stock, so that I imagine, or I'd like to think that by that time we'll have buildings that are closer to being net zero in terms of how they're designed, how they're built, what the features are. And therefore, it means that service accommodation operators will begin with that plus, and their focus then have to be on the operations. And I can also imagine a time where travel or decisions around travel and transport would also affect what the industry looks like. So if we continue to have digital nomads, it's quite likely we'll have people in apartments, service accommodation, living and working in the same place in any jurisdiction, any country of the world, rather than being confined to specific places and then traveling for shorter stays. Because if they're digital nomads, it means that they're not coming with the physical baggage in terms of material items. They're willing to use the items that you provide. So I'm optimistic in terms of it being embedded. What it will look like, I don't know. But I'd say that technology will play an important role, and the building stock that we use to accommodate guests will also be highly relevant.
Thanks, Veronica. And lastly, James, over to you.
Yeah, I'll be brief. We're in the early adopter stage, the very start of the bell curve. I think the big boys will see the opportunity probably in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time, and that they'll start to pick up on that, probably by some of the early adopters to accelerate their growth and learn from what they've done. However, the change is only going to happen if it happens at the highest level, and if legislation comes in to force the big guys, because that's where the majority of the impact is obviously being made. And so legislation has to come in to say, no, you have to do this within a certain time period, otherwise you're going to have to stop operating. So hopefully that will happen going forwards, and we'll see big change, as I'm forever an optimist, in 10 years' time.
Thanks, James. I'm just going to share my screen a moment. So thank you, everyone. That was a fascinating discussion. There's loads of food for thought there. At the end of the session, we're going to leave the chat open for 2 or 3 minutes because there's a lot of information. There's some links. and so on in there. So we're going to leave that open for a couple of minutes, so anybody watching who wants to make some notes from there can carry on. Our next webinar is on October the 21st, and it's called The Corporate Housing Market, How Has It Recovered and What Are the Prospects? You should be able to see the link to register for that in the chat. Now, later this month, we are launching an exciting new event called the Urban Living Festival. We've had to postpone a couple of times due to the pandemic, but it is happening at Tobacco Dock on the 26th and 27th. And we are looking at the convergence of various hospitality and real estate asset classes and the way cities are evolving. More information in the chat. It's going to be a really exciting event. On the subject of ESG and sustainability, we have got a session at the Urban Living Festival about ESG and impact investing. And on November the 4th, my colleague Eloise is hosting a Boutique Hotel News Trailblazer webinar about sustainability in hotel assets. And you should be able to see all the information you need about those in the chat. If you're interested in sponsoring any of our events or webinars, please contact my colleague Katie. You can see her contact details there, and also I believe in the chat. Do give us a follow across any of the social channels. We're quite active on all the ones you can see there. And I'd finally like to say a big thank you to James, to Richard, Veronica, Jacob and Toby for a great session. It's been really interesting. Do carry on the conversation with them afterwards. Their connections, their details are in the chat. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks everyone for being with us. See you on the next one. Thanks very much.